The mirror in the basement locker room of the Grand Lakeview Hotel had a crack running diagonally from the upper left corner to somewhere near the center, splitting every reflection into two slightly misaligned versions of the same face. Cole Brandt had been staring at that crack for 3 years, ever since he started picking up event shifts at the hotel, and he had never once seen anyone fix it. The fluorescent tube above flickered in its housing, throwing a pale, stuttering light across the row of dented metal lockers and the bench worn smooth by 1,000 pairs of work pants sliding across it. He adjusted the black tie against his throat, pulling the knot snug, feeling the collar press against his Adam's apple like a gentle reminder to keep his mouth shut. His hands trembled. Not dramatically, not the kind of shake that would make someone call a doctor, but a fine, persistent vibration in his fingers that he had learned to manage the way a carpenter learns to work around a warped board. He closed his fists, held them for 3 seconds, released. The tremor settled to something almost invisible. Almost. His left sleeve had ridden up during the adjustment, and he caught it in the cracked mirror before he caught it with his hand. The scar tissue began just above his wrist bone, a landscape of ridged, discolored skin that looked like melted wax had been poured down his forearm and cooled in uneven layers. It extended past the sleeve line, climbing toward his elbow, though no one at the Grand Lakeview had ever seen that far. He tugged the key down with the practiced speed of a man who had performed this exact motion 10,000 times. Covered. Gone. Just another thing tucked away where polite company wouldn't have to deal with it. Before turning to the door, his right hand drifted to the inside pocket of his black service vest. Fingers found the familiar shape through the fabric, a soft square folded into quarters, and pressed against it for a single beat. Still there. He didn't pull it out, didn't unfold it, didn't look at it. He didn't need to. He had memorized every thread, every faded stitch, every place where the cotton had thinned from years of handling. The ritual was the point. Touch, confirm, move forward. Like checking your weapon before stepping outside the wire. Like counting the rounds in your magazine, even though you counted them 4 minutes ago. Some habits keep you alive. Others just keep you moving when the reasons to move have gotten thin. My name is Cole Brandt, 28 years old. Southside Chicago, a studio apartment that smells like radiator dust and instant coffee where the pipes knock at 3 in the morning like something trying to get in or get out. Tonight, I am going to pour wine for the richest people in this city. They will look through me the way headlights look through fog, illuminating nothing, just passing through. I have been invisible my whole life. In foster homes, you learn to be small. In the Army, they teach you to be precise. In the service industry, they pay you to be both. The hallway from the locker room to the service elevator smelled of industrial cleaner and the ghost of 100 banquets. Cole walked it with his shoulders square, and his stride measured the black, non-slip shoes making no sound on the linoleum. He passed two other servers heading the opposite direction, a guy named Marco, who worked the bar, and a woman named Debbie, who handled the coat check on big nights and exchanged the standard nod that meant nothing more than acknowledgement of shared circumstance. They were all here for the same reason. The Grand Lakeview paid $12 an hour for event staff plus tips, and on a night like this, a Tier 1 corporate gala that tips in the VIP section could push a single shift north of $300. Cole had done the math so many times it was embedded in his muscle memory. $9,200 saved, $15,000 needed. The brochure for Lincoln Tech's 6-month automotive technology program was taped to his wall above the desk, where he ate his meals, its glossy photograph of a young mechanic leaning into an engine bay, starting to curl at the edges from the steam that rose off his evening ramen. Every dollar tonight was a dollar closer to that photograph becoming his life instead of his wallpaper. He had been chasing that number for 2 years since the day he walked into the Lincoln Tech campus on the Northwest Side and sat through an information session where a recruiter talked about career placement rates in average starting salaries and the dignity of skilled labor, and something in Cole's chest had shifted like a stuck gear finally finding its teeth. He had always been good with machines. In the Army, his MOS was 9-1B on wheeled vehicle mechanic, which meant he spent his deployment elbow-deep in Humvee engines and LMTV transmissions in a dusty motor pool at the edge of a forward operating base where the temperature hit 115 in the shade and the sand got into everything. Your food, your weapon, your dreams. He could diagnose a misfire by sound alone, could feel a failing bearing through a steering column, the way a doctor feels a pulse through skin. But the Army was over, had been over for a decade. What remained was the skill and the want and the $5,800 still missing, which at his current rate of saving meant roughly 4 more months of triple shifts in ramen and the particular loneliness of a man whose greatest ambition is to work with his hands in a small garage that nobody else would find remarkable. 3 jobs. That was the architecture of his days. Mornings at the Amazon warehouse in Joliet, 40 miles southwest, where he started at 5 and spent 6 hours loading and unloading trucks in a facility the size of an aircraft hangar. The kind of repetitive physical work that turned your body into a clock and your mind into something you had to actively prevent from drifting to places you couldn't afford to visit. Afternoons running DoorDash deliveries across the South Side and into Hyde Park, his 10-year-old Honda Civic burning oil at a rate that he monitored with the same attention a pilot gives to fuel gauges. Evenings when the Grand Lakeview called in the uniform and the silence and the careful choreography of making wealthy people comfortable without reminding them that comfort required labor. He did not complain about any of it. Complaining was a luxury that required an audience, and Cole Brandt had lived most of his life without one. 6 foster homes before he turned 16, none of them abusive in any dramatic headline-making way, just a sequence of houses where he was fed and sheltered and treated with the cordial indifference of people fulfilling a civic obligation. Nobody hit him, nobody starved him, nobody told him he was worthless. They just never told him he was theirs. The Army changed that. For the first time in his life, he belonged to something, a unit, a purpose, a chain of command that told him where to be and what to do, and that his presence mattered to the functioning of a machine larger than himself. He had loved it with the desperate, uncritical love of someone who had never been chosen before. And then the machine had broken him, or rather an improvised explosive device buried in a road near Gardes had broken the vehicle he was riding in, and the vehicle had broken his left leg, and the fire had remade his left arm, and a man named Dean Prescott had pulled him out of the wreckage and gone back for someone else and not come back at all. That was the part he didn't talk about. Not at the warehouse, not on deliveries, not at the Grand Lakeview, not anywhere. He carried it the way he carried the object in his vest pocket close to his chest, checked daily, never displayed. The service elevator opened onto the second floor and the sound hit him first. A live jazz orchestra, warming up the murmur of 500 voices bouncing off marble and crystal, the percussive pop of champagne corks, and beneath it all, the low electrical hum of a building straining to contain this much money in one room. The Grand Lakeview's main ballroom was a cathedral of excess. Crystal chandeliers hung from a coffered ceiling that had been restored 3 times since the hotel's construction in 1922, each one throwing prismatic light across the room like trapped stars leaking through their cages. The tables were draped in white linen so crisp it looked starched into geometry, and the centerpieces were elaborate arrangements of white roses and peonies that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Probably. He had stopped doing that particular conversion because it made the champagne taste bitter in his mouth, and bitter champagne was harder to pour with a smile. Janet Miller intercepted him at the service entrance to the ballroom, clipboard in hand, reading glasses perched on her nose, her expression carrying the specific gravity of a woman who had managed events at the Grand Lakeview for 11 years and had seen every possible way a night could go wrong. She was 48, built like a distance runner who had traded the track for hotel corridors, and she ran her staff with a fairness that was indistinguishable from strictness. Her eyes swept him top to bottom in the half-second it took her to verify his uniform was correct. Tonight was Tier 1, Prescott Holdings' 30th anniversary gala. 500 guests. CEO Malcolm Prescott would be in attendance. She did not need to explain what that meant. Tier 1 meant no mistakes. Tier 1 meant invisible. Tier 1 meant if a guest dropped a napkin, you had a fresh one in your hand before the original hit the floor. Cole was assigned to the VIP section tables 1 through 12 because Janet had learned over 3 years that he possessed the 2 qualities most valuable in high-end service. He did not talk and he did not stare. He moved through rooms the way water moves through plumbing, essential unseen, and only noticed when something went wrong. The briefing lasted 2 minutes. Cole memorized the seating chart, the wine list, the dietary restrictions flagged for tables 4 and 9, and the emergency exits, which were not part of the briefing, but which he cataloged automatically, the way he cataloged every room he entered, every building he worked, in every space where the distance between himself and the nearest door might someday matter. This was not something he chose to do. It was something that had been wired into him at a forward operating base in a province whose name he could spell but not say without his throat tightening, and it had never unwired. He entered the ballroom carrying a tray of champagne flutes, and the contrast swallowed him. An hour ago, he had been in a basement locker room with a cracked mirror and flickering lights. Now he moved through a room where the air smelled of expensive cologne and fresh-cut flowers and the faint, bright tang of $200 champagne, where men in tailored tuxedos laughed over cigars they weren't supposed to be smoking indoors, where women in gowns that cost more than his car caught the chandelier light on diamond earrings and sent it scattering across the room like tiny expensive fires. He held the tray at exactly the right height, 30 inches from the floor, angled 15 degrees toward the guest the way Janet had trained him. Label facing the guest. Stop pouring at 2/3. The neck of the bottle never touches the rim of the glass. These were skills. Not glamorous skills, not the kind that earned degrees or promotions or respect at cocktail parties, but skills nonetheless, and Cole performed them with the same precision he had once applied to replacing a water pump on an M1151 Humvee in 100-degree heat. The work mattered because he decided it mattered. That was enough. One bouquet of flowers on that table over there probably equaled his rent for a month. But nobody here thought about that. Nobody here had to think about that. That was the real difference between rich and poor. Not the money itself, but the things you never had to think about. He circled the VIP section for 20 minutes, refilling glasses, clearing appetizer plates, reading the body language of guests to anticipate needs before they became requests. Table 3 wanted more of the Veuve Clicquot. Table 7's eldest woman was nursing her glass, so he didn't approach. Table 11 had an empty chair that no one seemed to be missing. He registered all of it with the peripheral awareness that had once kept him alive on night patrols and now kept him employed at dinner parties. And he was rounding the arc toward table 5 when something in the geometry of the room pulled his attention to the far corner. A young woman sat alone at a round table set for 8, 7 chairs empty. Not empty in the way of guests who had stepped away to dance or mingle, but empty in the way of chairs that had never been intended to be filled props in a stage design meant to suggest she was part of a larger group, when the reality was that she was an island and she wore a navy blue gown that reached the floor, elegant in its simplicity, and her dark hair fell loose over the left side of her face in a way that might have looked casual to someone who wasn't paying attention. Cole was always paying attention. The hair was a curtain, a deliberate one. She held a glass of water, not champagne, in her lap with both hands the way someone holds a lifeline they don't actually believe in. Her shoulders were hunched slightly forward, not the dramatic hunch of someone in pain, but the subtle compression of someone trying to take up less space to shrink the target area, to disappear in a room that wouldn't let her. He might not have noticed her at all, one quiet woman in a sea of 500 loud people except for the way she was sitting. And he noticed the way she was sitting because he recognized it the way you recognize your own handwriting on a stranger's wall. She sat the way he had sat for the first 6 months after they discharged him from Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, with a rebuilt left leg and a left arm that looked like a topographic map of somewhere no one wanted to visit. Back against the chair, eyes scanning the room in quick, nervous sweeps, never lingering, always cataloging. Not looking at anyone but tracking everyone. Looking for exits, looking for threats, looking for the moment when someone's gaze would land on her and stay too long, the moment when curiosity or pity or revulsion would cross a stranger's face and she would have to decide again how to absorb it. She wasn't afraid of bombs. She was afraid of being seen. He knew that feeling the way he knew his own pulse. The hair shifted when she turned to glance toward the dance floor and the chandelier light caught what she had been hiding. A scar. It started at her left temple and traveled downward in an irregular line, like a river drawn by an unsteady hand crossing her cheekbone and ending somewhere near the angle of her jaw. It was not fresh. The tissue had settled into itself, raised and pale against her skin, the kind of scar that had healed on the outside and continued its work on the inside. It was prominent, undeniable, in a room full of people who had paid a great deal of money to present unblemished surfaces to each other, and it explained the empty chairs and the curtain of hair, and the way she held that glass of water, like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the table instead of running for the nearest exit. Cole had seen worse. In the motor pool in the field hospital in the mirror. He registered the scar the way he registered the chandeliers and the champagne and the flowers as a fact of the environment and moved on to what actually mattered. The body language, the compression, the scanning. She was in survival mode, running on the fumes of whatever obligation or guilt or love had brought her to this room, and she was burning through those fumes fast. He glanced at the seating chart he had memorized. Table 14, Nora Prescott, 24, daughter of the host. From the VIP seating chart, he already knew the head table. Table 1, Malcolm Prescott, CEO, the man whose name was on the building tonight, or at least on the banner, which amounted to the same thing in this world. Cole found him easily. 58 years old, silver hair trimmed with military precision, a charcoal suit that fit him the way good suits fit men who can afford to have them built rather than bought. Malcolm stood at table 1 shaking hands with a rotation of executives and partners, his smile calibrated to project warmth and authority, in equal measure the smile of a man who had spent 30 years learning to make people feel important while revealing nothing about himself. It was a good performance, almost flawless. Almost. Because every 3 or 4 minutes between handshakes and toasts and the practiced laughter of corporate bonhomie, Malcolm Prescott's eyes drifted to the far corner of the ballroom, where his daughter sat alone, and in the half-second before he caught himself, his face underwent a transformation so brief and so total that only someone watching very carefully would have seen it. The smile vanished. The jaw tightened. The eyes went soft with a helplessness that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or shareholder meetings. Then the mask returned, the hand extended, the next guest greeted, and Malcolm Prescott was the CEO again. That wasn't the look of a man reviewing his event. That was a father watching his child drown from across a room where he couldn't make a sound. Cole noticed one other thing. Malcolm's left hand, the one not shaking hands, kept moving to his ring finger, where a gold wedding band caught the light every time he turned it. Turning it, around and around, a slow rotation that matched no rhythm except the one inside his chest. Catherine Prescott had been dead for 3 years, according to the background material Janet had distributed to the senior staff, so they wouldn't make the mistake of asking about the CEO's wife. 3 years, and the ring was still there, still being turned, still marking time on a clock that had stopped. Cole poured champagne at table 6 and moved toward the bar for a fresh tray. The bar was situated along the east wall, a long mahogany counter staffed by 2 bartenders and flanked by high cocktail tables where guests gathered in loose clusters to drink standing up, which in Cole's experience meant they were either networking or avoiding their assigned seats. He was reaching for a fresh row of flutes when the voices hit him. 4 men, early 30s. The kind of suits that cost what Cole earned in 2 months, worn with the casual disregard of people who had never thought about the price of anything they put on their bodies. They stood at the nearest cocktail table, drinks in hand, voices pitched at the particular volume of men who believed their opinions were gifts to whatever room contained them. Cole was 2 steps behind them, facing away, arranging flutes on his tray, and to them he was furniture. Less than furniture. Furniture you noticed when you needed to sit down. He was the space between the furniture, the nothing that made the something possible. The tallest of them was doing most of the talking. Broad shoulders, jaw like a geometry problem, hairstyled with the kind of product that cost $40 a bottle and smelled like it wanted you to know. His name, Cole would learn later, was Wade Harmon. 30 years old, son of Harrison Harmon, who owned 15% of Prescott Holdings and occupied table 3 with his wife and 2 business associates. Wade was at this gala the way a gold watch is at a gala, because someone powerful brought it and expected it to look expensive. Wade was telling a story, and the story was about the woman in the far corner. He spoke with the easy cruelty of someone who had never been held accountable for a word that left his mouth. He told his friends that he had almost had Nora Prescott back before, dated her a few times when she was at Northwestern, took her to a restaurant in Lincoln Park, bought her flowers, did everything right. But she thought she was too good for him. Turned him down cold. Didn't even give him a reason, just the smile and the thanks, but no thanks, and the door. He said this with the specific bitterness of a man who had cataloged a rejection the way some people catalog debts, with interest compounding daily. Then he looked toward her corner, and the bitterness sharpened into something uglier. His friends leaned in. Wade dropped his voice to a stage whisper, the kind designed to be overheard by anyone close enough to be impressed by his indifference to decency. Look at her now. Scarred goods. Who'd want that? The words hit Cole like a rifle crack. His hand stopped mid-reach, fingers hovering over a champagne flute, and for a moment the entire room compressed into a single point of sound and memory. Because he had heard those exact words before. Not the same voice, not the same room, but the same words arranged in the same order, aimed at the same target, which was anyone unlucky enough to carry their damage where people could see it. Brooke Army Medical Center, San Antonio, Texas, July 2016. He was 3 weeks out of surgery on his left leg, the skin grafts on his arms still raw and weeping through the bandages, and he was supposed to be asleep when the night nurse came in to check his IV. She thought he was unconscious. Most patients in that wing were sedated against the kind of pain that makes sleep a medical necessity rather than a natural function. But Cole had always been a light sleeper, lighter still after a deployment in a place where the difference between sleeping and dying was sometimes just a matter of which direction you rolled when the mortar hit. He lay still with his eyes closed and listened to her speak to the orderly in the hallway, her voice carrying the tired, unguarded tone of someone at the end of a 12-hour shift. Poor kid. Scarred up like that, no family who's gonna want him. She didn't mean it as cruelty. She meant it as pity, which was worse because pity had the decency to feel bad about the damage it did. That sentence had followed Cole out of the hospital, out of San Antonio, through a string of rented rooms in Indianapolis and Milwaukee, and finally to Chicago, where it had settled into the architecture of his self-perception like a load-bearing wall that he couldn't remove without risking the whole structure. Who's gonna want him? It wasn't a question, it was a diagnosis, and he had accepted it the way he accepted the tremor in his hands, and the limp that came out when he was tired, and the way his left arm looked under fluorescent light as another fact of the environment, immutable and unremarkable. But hearing it aimed at someone else, at a woman sitting alone in a corner, with her hair drawn like a curtain over the evidence of whatever had been done to her, something in the architecture shifted. A wall moved, not much, just enough to let light into a room that had been dark for a long time. His hand tightened on the neck of the champagne bottle. He could feel the glass grow warm under his grip, could feel the tendons in his forearm pulling taut against the scar tissue that limited their range, and for approximately 2 seconds, he entertained the very clear, very satisfying image of walking over to that cocktail table and introducing Wade Harmon's expensive suit to the contents of a full bottle of Dom Perignon. 2 seconds. Then the training took over the layer beneath the anger, the one that had been installed by people who understood that discipline was not the absence of impulse, but the management of it, and his hand relaxed, and the bottle stayed where it was, and Wade Harmon continued to exist in an unsoaked condition. Cole looked at Nora instead. She had heard. He knew because her shoulders had climbed an inch higher, the compression tightening like a fist closing around itself. Her fingers whitened on the glass of water. Her eyes blinked rapidly, the quick mechanical flutter of someone fighting the biology of tears, and her jaw set in a line that was trying very hard to be defiance, but was actually just pain wearing a mask. She didn't stand up. She didn't turn around. She didn't give Wade Harmon the satisfaction of a reaction, which meant she had practice at this, which meant this was not the first time someone had said something like that, where she could hear it, which meant she had been absorbing versions of this moment for 3 years, sitting still and small, while the words landed and the scar burned, and the empty chairs around her confirmed what the voices were saying. At the head table, Malcolm Prescott had gone rigid. His hand stopped turning the ring. His jaw clenched with such force that Cole could see the muscles jump from 40 feet away. He had heard it too. Of course he had. A father's hearing is selectively superhuman when it comes to his children's pain. But he didn't move. Couldn't move, because moving meant making a scene, and making a scene meant pulling the spotlight onto Nora, and the spotlight was exactly what was killing her. Malcolm Prescott had the kind of power that could buy buildings and destroy careers and reshape the skyline of a major American city, and none of it, not 1 cent of it, could protect his daughter from 4 men with loud voices and small hearts standing 12 feet from the bar. Power like that came with its own cages. Wade said something else, something about his old man's deal with Malcolm, How Harrison Harmon was practically family at this point, 15% stake in Prescott Holdings, which meant Wade could say whatever he wanted about whoever he wanted because his father's money was stitched into the foundation of this company. His friends laughed. The sound was the specific frequency of men who had confused wealth with permission. Cole set the bottle down. The tray was full. He had a job to do. Tables to serve, glasses to fill a shift to finish $300, to earn 4 more months of saving to endure before Lincoln Tech became real instead of a curling photograph on a wall. He had every reason to pick up that tray and walk it back into the ballroom and pour champagne and clear plates and collect his envelope at the end of the night and go home to his studio apartment and mark another line on the brochure and fall asleep to the sound of the electric fan he ran year-round because silence was too close to the silence that came before explosions. Every reason to walk away, except for one voice which was not in the room and had not been in any room for 10 years, but which lived inside his chest like a second heartbeat, steady and inescapable, and belonging to a man named Dean Prescott, who had once said in the motor pool at FOB Gardez's, while they were replacing a differential on a truck that had no business still running, that the measure of a person was not what they did when the whole world was watching, but what they did when nobody was watching, and doing nothing was the easiest thing in the world. You don't leave someone behind, Brant. That's the one rule that doesn't have an exception. The orchestra shifted tempos. The bright up-tempo jazz that had been filling the room for the past hour softened into something slower, a waltz string swelling and falling in gentle waves that pulled couples from their tables and onto the dance floor. Cole watched them go, men in tuxedos and women in gowns, moving together with the rehearsed ease of people who had been taking dance lessons since childhood, who inhabited their bodies the way they inhabited their wealth, with total unquestioning confidence. The dance floor filled. The lights dimmed a fraction. The room became a moving painting, all gold and white, in the slow rotation of bodies that had never doubted their right to be seen. In the far corner, Nora Prescott shrank. Her chair might as well have been swallowing her. She turned her head away from the dance floor, toward the wall, and Cole could see the effort it took, the deliberate refusal to watch other people do the things she believed she had lost the right to do. The scar caught the light as she turned, and for a moment it looked less like a wound and more like a fault line, the visible evidence of a place where something had broken and was still breaking. The two voices in his head went to war. The first voice was math. It was the calculator he had built out of necessity, the one that tallied every dollar and weighed every risk and understood with perfect clarity that walking across that ballroom to talk to the CEO's daughter was the professional equivalent of throwing a lit match into a gas tank. Janet Miller ran a tight operation. She had 12 rules about guest interaction, and the first 11 were different ways of saying the same thing. You do not approach a guest uninvited. You do not initiate conversation. You do not make yourself the center of anything. You are a function, not a person. Violating those rules during a Tier 1 event would cost him his job at the Grand Lakeview, which would cost him his highest-paying shift, which would delay Lincoln Tech by months, which would delay the garage, which would delay the entire fragile architecture of the life he was trying to build, one ramen dinner at a time. The second voice was Dean's. It didn't calculate. It didn't weigh. It just spoke with the maddening, unshakable certainty of a man who had run toward a burning vehicle while everyone else was running away. And it said the same thing. It always said the same thing it had said 10 years ago when Cole was pinned in the wreckage with smoke filling his lungs and the heat blistering through his sleeve, and a voice above the roar had called his name and told him to hold on. But the calculator wasn't finished. It ran the numbers one more time, tallied the cost of $300 lost dollars in a delayed dream, and the look on Janet Miller's face when she found out, and it presented the total with the cold precision of a machine that does not care about anything except arithmetic. The total was significant. The total was months of setback. The total was the difference between a plan and a fantasy. And still the second voice spoke, not louder, just steadier. The way a compass needle doesn't argue with a magnet, it just points. Cole set the tray down on the service stand nearest the bar. The motion was deliberate, careful the way you set down something you know you might not pick up again. He untied his service apron and folded it. Not balled, not tossed. Folded the way you fold a flag, because even when you're about to do the most reckless thing you've done in 3 years, You fold what needs folding. That's discipline. Not the absence of fear, but the insistence on order even in its presence. He straightened his tie, smoothed the front of his vest, touched the inside pocket one more time, felt the square of folded cotton against his fingertips, and drew a breath that went all the way down to the place where the second voice lived. Then he walked. Each step toward her was a step outside the defensive perimeter of the life he had built. No safety net, no covering fire, no squad on his flanks. Just a polished wood floor stretching ahead of him like open ground, and 500 people whose peripheral vision was about to register something anomalous. A server in a black vest moving with purpose toward a table. He had no business approaching, his stride steady, and his shoulders set at the particular angle of a man who had made a decision and was now committed to its consequences. The tables nearest Nora's corner noticed first. Conversations didn't stop so much as stutter the way a car engine hiccups when a fuel line catches air. Heads turned by degrees. A man at table 13 paused mid-sentence with a champagne glass halfway to his lips. A woman at the next table leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind her hand. The ripple spread outward, slow but inexorable, and by the time Cole stopped one measured step from Nora's chair, a circle of silence had formed around them, a bubble where the music still played, but the human noise had been replaced by the particular frequency of collective attention. He stood with his hands behind his back, clasped at the wrist, prayed rest, the default posture of every soldier who has ever waited for something to happen while pretending to be at ease. Nora didn't look up. She was staring at her glass of water with the fierce concentration of someone using an object as a shield. Cole didn't push. He waited. 3 seconds. 5. Long enough for the silence to announce him. When he spoke, his voice was pitched for her ears only low, and even a voice that had been trained to carry across motor pools and not carry across rooms. And he used it now with the same care he used when handling something fragile that didn't know it was fragile. "Excuse me. Would you do me the honor of a dance?" Nora's head came up slowly, the way a door opens when the person behind it isn't sure what's on the other side. Her eyes found his face first, then dropped to his uniform. The black vest, the name tag, the service apron that was conspicuously absent, and he watched her process the information in real time. Waiter. He's a waiter. The recognition moved across her features like a weather system confusion, giving way to suspicion, giving way to something he hadn't expected, which was fear. Not fear of him, fear of hope, fear that this might be genuine and therefore might be taken away. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, rough at the edges, like a machine that hadn't been started in a long time. "You're the waiter." "Yes, ma'am." Her eyes searched his face the way you search a room for hidden cameras, looking for the catch, the setup, the moment when someone would laugh and the joke would land and she would be the punchline again. Cole held her gaze and let her look. He had nothing to hide and nothing to sell. He was just a man standing in front of a woman asking a simple question. Why one word? One syllable. But it carried the weight of 3 years of empty chairs and drawn curtains and whispered cruelties and a scar that never stopped speaking even when she did. Why? Why would you do this? Why would you risk your job? Why would you cross this room for me? Why would anyone? Cole didn't have a smooth answer. He didn't have a rehearsed line or a gallant speech or any of the polished phrases that the men in this room deployed like currency. He had an honest answer, and honest answers are never smooth. They have rough edges and unfinished surfaces, and they arrive a half beat late because the person speaking them is actually thinking instead of performing. Because no one should sit alone in a room full of music. The words settled between them like something placed rather than thrown. Nora's lips parted. Her eyes glistened a sudden brightness that she fought with the same rapid blinking he had seen before, and her fingers tightened on the glass in her lap until the knuckles went white. She looked at the dance floor where couples moved in the golden light like figures in a music box, and then she looked back at him, and in the space between those two looks, something turned over in her, a key in a lock that had rusted shut. She set the glass on the table. Slowly, as if the motion itself was a commitment she could still reverse. Then she placed her hand in his. It was cool. It was trembling. It was the hand of someone who had not voluntarily touched another person in a very long time, and it held his the way a person holds a rope thrown to them in deep water. Too tight, too desperate, but unwilling to let go, even if the grip itself was painful. Cole closed his fingers around hers gently, the way you close your hand around a bird that has landed there by accident, and helped her to her feet. The ballroom held its breath. Or maybe that was him. The silence that had formed around their table expanded outward like a pressure wave, pushing the murmurs and the clinks and the laughter to the edges of the room, and in its center, Cole Brandt served veteran, orphan, nobody-led Nora Prescott, daughter of the most powerful man in the building, toward the edge of the dance floor. Not the center, the edge. Cole chose the position instinctively, the same way he chose where to sit in restaurants, and where to stand in elevators, and where to park his car in lots, always at the perimeter, always with a clear line to the exit, always with his back to a wall or a window rather than an open room. Tactical positioning applied to a waltz. He placed his free hand lightly against her back, maintaining the distance of formality, and began to move. He did not know how to waltz. He knew how to march. But it turned out that if you kept your steps even and your frame steady and your weight centered, the two activities were closer than anyone would admit. He moved in simple and hurried patterns, box steps that a dancing instructor would have called elementary and a drill sergeant would have called adequate, and the steadiness of it, the lack of flourish, the refusal to perform, was exactly what Nora needed. She didn't need impressive. She needed solid ground. She was rigid at first. Her body held the stiffness of someone bracing for impact, every muscle locked, every joint resistant, as if dancing were a form of exposure. And she was waiting for the part where it started to hurt. Her eyes fixed on the floor between their feet, watching her own steps with a concentration that had nothing to do with choreography and everything to do with not looking up, not seeing the faces, not meeting the eyes that she could feel pressing against her from every direction. His voice came low enough that only she could hear it, barely above the music, steady as the steps. Eyes up. Don't give them the satisfaction of looking down. It was not a romantic thing to say. It was a soldier's thing, a thing you said to the person next to you when the fire was coming and the instinct was to drop, when every nerve was screaming at you to make yourself small, to duck, to hide, and you needed someone to remind you that hiding was just a slower way of losing. Nora heard the difference. Her chin lifted. Her eyes found his, and for the first time since he had approached her table, she actually looked at him. The scar caught the light fully when she raised her face, and up close it was more than a line. It was a landscape ridged and branching, tissue pulling slightly at the corner of her eye, and the edge of her mouth altering the symmetry of her features in a way that most people in this room would have called disfigurement, and Cole, who had studied his own altered skin in 100 different mirrors, simply called evidence. Evidence of survival. Evidence of a story that didn't end when it easily could have. Her eyes were hazel dark ringed, holding the particular exhaustion of someone who had been carrying weight for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. But they were also deep and sharp and present in a way that cut through the ballroom's superficial glitter like a blade through silk. This was not a woman who lacked intelligence or strength. This was a woman who had been convinced by repetition and by silence and by the accumulated cruelty of 1,000 small moments that the scar on her face was the most interesting thing about her. They turned, one step, then another. Her grip on his hand loosened by a fraction. Her shoulders dropped a centimeter. Her breathing, which had been short and shallow and caught somewhere between her throat and her chest, began to reach her lungs. The music wrapped around them, string and piano, and the soft brush of a snare drum, keeping time, and within that wrapping, a space opened up. Not a physical space, something else. The space between bracing for pain and beginning to believe, just beginning, not yet committed, but leaning in that direction the way a tree leans toward light, that the pain might not come this time. 3 minutes in, something changed. Her steps found the rhythm, not perfectly, not gracefully, but naturally, the way a stream finds its channel after a blockage clears. Her hand in his went from gripping to holding, and then so small and so fragile that a person watching from more than 5 feet away might have missed it entirely, a smile. It was not a big smile. It did not transform her face or light up the room or any of the other things that smiles are supposed to do in stories. It was the barest upward movement of her lips, a hairline fracture in the wall she had built around herself, and it reached her eyes the way dawn reaches a window. Not all at once, but in slow degrees, turning the exhaustion into something that might, if given enough time and enough reason, become something else. It made the scar look less like a verdict and more like a chapter heading. The story of what happened, not the story of what came next. From table one, Malcolm Prescott stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped against the floor with a sound that cut through the nearest conversations like a blade. His right hand came up to cover his mouth. His left hand, the one with the ring, gripped the edge of the table so hard that his knuckles matched the white linen. His shoulders began to shake. Not a tremor, not a vibration. A full-body shudder, the kind that comes from the place below the ribs where men store the things they can't afford to feel during business hours. Tears ran down his face, streaking the composed exterior of a 58-year-old CEO who had survived 30 years of boardroom warfare without displaying a single crack, and he did not wipe them away. He could not. He was watching his daughter smile, truly smile, for what might have been the first time since the accident that took his wife and redrew his daughter's face and ended the version of his family that he had spent 20 years building. The room's reactions fractured into pieces. At the nearest tables, people stared with the open-mouthed confusion of an audience that had lost the script. A few whispered to each other, trying to construct a narrative that explained why a waiter was dancing with the host's daughter. Others looked away, embarrassed by the intimacy of the moment or by their own failure to have caused it. At the cocktail tables near the bar, Wade Harmon's group had gone quiet, their smirks dissolving into something harder to name, the specific discomfort of men who have made fun of someone only to watch that someone rise. Nora noticed none of it. Her focus was on Cole, on the steady frame of his arms and the even cadence of his steps, and with each turn, she unwound another fraction, releasing something she had been holding so tightly and for so long that the release itself was almost painful, like blood returning to a limb that had fallen asleep. From rigid to tentative, from tentative to present, from present to something approaching. Not happiness, not yet, but the memory of what happiness felt like, the ghost of it passing through the room and pausing long enough to be recognized. The song neared its end. The strings rose to a gentle peak and then began to descend, the notes tapering like a hand slowly opening. Nora's breathing had steadied. Her shoulders had dropped to where they belonged. Her hand in his was warm now, no longer trembling, and when she spoke, her voice caught on something that wasn't sadness, but might have been its opposite. Thank you. Cole kept his voice level, though something behind his sternum was doing its best to betray him. He hadn't done anything yet. She was the one who had stood up. She was the one who had placed her hand in his and stepped onto a floor that terrified her and let 500 people see her face in full light. He had just asked. She had answered. I haven't done anything. You were the one who stood up. She smiled again, fuller this time. Still fragile, still new, but gaining strength, the way a flame gains strength when someone cups their hands around it and breathes very carefully. It reached both eyes now, and the scar, instead of fighting, seemed to accommodate it, the raised tissue shifting as her cheek lifted, becoming part of the expression instead of its contradiction. The orchestra held its last note, letting it ring across the ballroom before fading into silence. The dancers on the floor began to separate, returning to their tables, to their drinks, to the comfortable performance of an evening they understood. Cole stepped back, preparing to bow his head and disappear back into the machinery of service, back to the trays and the bottles and the invisibility that was both his profession and his prison. One moment of defiance paid for, finished. Time to return to the edges. But as he stepped back and lowered his chin, his vest shifted against his chest, and the folded square of cotton that had lived in his inside pocket for 10 years through 2 apartments in 3 cities and 1,000 nights, where it was the only thing he touched before sleeping and the first thing he touched upon waking, slipped free of the pocket's worn seam and fell. It landed on the polished wood floor with no sound at all. A small square of faded blue cotton folded into quarters, embroidered in one corner, with tiny golden flowers and 2 letters stitched in thread that had once been bright and was now the color of old honey. DP. Malcolm Prescott was 15 feet away and closing, walking toward them with the quick, purposeful stride of a man who had just watched something impossible and needed to understand it. His eyes were still wet. His hand was still at his mouth. But when he saw the handkerchief on the floor, when the faded blue fabric and the golden stitching and the 2 letters registered in his vision, he stopped as if he had walked into glass. Every molecule of his body locked. His face, already stripped of its professional composure, went through a transformation that Cole would remember for the rest of his life. Recognition, disbelief, then a pain so old and so deep that it predated the chandeliers and the company and the suit and the title, and reached all the way back to a kitchen in Evanston, Illinois, where a woman with steady hands and perfect stitches had embroidered forget-me-nots on cotton for a son who was going to war. Malcolm covered the remaining distance in 3 strides. He bent down and picked up the handkerchief with both hands, cradling it the way you cradle something that has been missing for so long that finding it feels less like recovery and more like resurrection. His fingers traced the embroidery, following the curves of the golden flowers, pressing into the initials, reading them like Braille, like a message from the dead written in thread. When he looked up at Cole, his voice was a ruin. "Where did you get this?" The ballroom went silent. The orchestra had paused between songs, and into that gap rushed the weight of 500 held breaths and Malcolm Prescott's question, which was not really a question at all, but a door being thrown open onto a room that had been locked for 10 years. Cole stood with the golden light of the chandeliers falling across his black vest in his trembling hands, and the face of a man who had just realized that the small private ritual he had performed every day for a decade, the touch, the confirmation, the silent promise, was about to become the most public moment of his life. The handkerchief was no longer his. It had never been his. It had been held in trust, carried across time and distance, and the vast and different machinery of a life that had never quite found its footing, and now the trust was ending, and the truth was beginning, and the room was waiting, and Malcolm Prescott's ruined voice was still echoing off the crystal and the marble and the white linen, asking a question that Cole had spent 10 years not answering. "Where did you get this?" The silence pressed in from every direction. Cole looked at the handkerchief in Malcolm's shaking hands, at Nora, standing beside her father, with her eyes wide and her scar luminous in the chandelier light, at the 500 faces turned toward him like flowers toward a son they hadn't expected. He opened his mouth, and the story that had lived inside his chest for a decade, curled around his bones like ivy around a ruin, began finally to find its way out. The answer came from a place below, thought, below calculation, below the 10 years of silence and avoidance, and carrying something too heavy to hold and too sacred to set down. Cole's voice emerged steady, the muscle memory of military reporting taking over where his civilian nerves would have failed, and the words arranged themselves in the only order that mattered, which was the order of facts. "My name is Cole Brandt, sir. I served under your brother's Staff Sergeant Dean Prescott, 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry Regiment, Paktia Province, 2016. Malcolm's knees gave. Not all at once, not a collapse, but a slow mechanical failure, the way a bridge sags before it breaks, and his hands shot out to grip the nearest table edge with a force that turned his fingertips white. The handkerchief stayed in his other hand, pressed against his chest now, over the place where his heart was doing something it hadn't done in 10 years, which was remembering the exact shape of the hole his brother had left. Nora moved instinctively, her hand finding her father's arm, steadying him, her eyes shuttling between the man she had known her whole life and the stranger in the black vest who had just detonated a sentence in the middle of a ballroom. "Dad." Her voice was barely a sound, just the word and the fear behind it, and the confusion of watching the most powerful person in her world become suddenly terrifyingly human. Malcolm didn't look at her. His gaze was locked on Cole with the fixed intensity of a man staring at a door he had believed was sealed forever, watching it swing open. The tears came without ceremony, without the customary male resistance, without the jaw-clenching, throat-clearing architecture of suppression that men of his generation and his station had been taught to deploy. They simply fell, tracking down the grooves of a face that had spent 30 years learning to reveal nothing, and they carried with them the accumulated weight of a decade of wondering. Cole recognized that weight. He carried a version of it himself, different in shape, but identical in mass, and seeing it in Malcolm's face was like looking into a mirror that reflected not appearance but burden. The ballroom had achieved a silence so complete that Cole could hear the faint electrical hum of the chandelier dimmers and the distant rhythm of a kitchen. Somewhere below them, cooks who didn't know that 500 people had stopped breathing. He kept his eyes on Malcolm and his posture straight, because posture was the last thing the Army had given him that still worked in every situation, and he let the silence hold for exactly as long as Malcolm needed it to hold. Then Malcolm spoke, and his voice was the voice of a man dismantling something he had constructed very carefully over a very long time. This was our mother's stitching. She made this for him before he deployed. Eleanor, she did French knots. Nobody else did them quite like her. She said they were luck. She said if she put enough of them in the thread, he'd have to come home. His fingers traced the golden flowers again, and Cole watched a 58-year-old billionaire touch embroidered forget-me-nots with the tenderness of a child holding something breakable. He didn't come home. The three words landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water, and the ripples spread outward through the ballroom, reaching tables where people had been reaching for their glasses and stopping them. Mid-motion reaching the bar, where Wade Harmon's group stood frozen in the particular paralysis of men who were beginning to understand that they were standing on the wrong side of something, reaching the orchestra pit, where musicians sat with their instruments at rest and their faces turned toward the tableau at the edge of the dance floor. Cole nodded. The motion was small, contained the nod of someone confirming what both parties already knew, but needed to make real by acknowledging it aloud. Then he began to speak, and the words came out in the clipped, precise cadence of an after-action report, because that was the only framework he had for telling this story, the only container strong enough to hold it without breaking. Routine mounted patrol. 3 vehicles on Highway 1 near Gardez. His vehicle was second in the convoy. Dean's was the lead. The road had been cleared that morning by an engineer team, but IEDs moved in that country the way weather moved everywhere else, unpredictably and without respect for schedules. The blast hit beneath the engine block of the second vehicle at 13:47 hours. Cole remembered the time because the dashboard clock was the last thing he saw before the world inverted, the numbers glowing green in the sudden darkness, as the armored truck flipped onto its side and the fire found the fuel line. He was in the back seat, right side. The impact pinned his left leg beneath the seat frame, which had buckled inward like a fist closing, and the fire came through the floor panels with a sound that was less like burning and more like breathing, a living sound, hungry and patient. Smoke filled the cabin in seconds. Corporal James Webb was in the driver's way, unconscious, bleeding from a head wound that had painted the cracked windshield in a pattern Cole could still see when he closed his eyes. The gunner specialist Dawson had been thrown clear by the blast. He was alive. He was screaming. But he was outside, and Cole and Webb were inside, and inside was where the fire lived. Cole had spent those trapped seconds doing the only thing he could do, which was staying conscious and pulling at his pinned leg with both hands, while the fire climbed his left sleeve and began rewriting the skin of his forearm in a language he would spend the rest of his life reading. Then Dean was there, his face appearing in the shattered window of the rear door, like something conjured, soot-streaked and focused with the terrifying clarity of a man who has already done the math and accepted the result. He didn't hesitate, didn't assess, didn't radio for support or wait for the fire team or do any of the procedurally correct things that the manual said to do. He braced his boots against the frame and pulled Cole free with a grip that left bruises Cole wore for weeks afterward, bruises he was secretly grateful for because they were proof that the hands that saved him had been real. Dean dragged him 30 meters from the vehicle, set him in the ditch, checked his breathing, looked at the arm which was already blistering beneath the melted sleeve, and said something Cole didn't wait catch because his ears were ringing from the blast. Then Dean stood up, turned around, and went back toward the fire, back toward the vehicle where Webb was still pinned and still unconscious and still bleeding. Cole tried to stand, his left leg folded beneath him like paper. He shouted Dean's name, or thought he did, but the sound that came out was swallowed by the roar of the fire and the shouts of the rest of the convoy and the approaching whine of the medevac that someone had already called. He watched Dean reach the vehicle, watched him lean in through the driver's side window, watched his hands find Webb's harness and begin to pull. The second IED detonated 11 meters from the first. The blast threw Dean sideways and drove the vehicle's door inward, and when the dust cleared enough to see Dean was on the ground between the vehicle and the ditch, and Webb was half out of the window, alive, breathing, pulled far enough from the fire to survive, because Dean Prescott had positioned his own body between the explosion and the man he was saving. Cole's voice had not wavered through any of this. It wavered now. He was conscious for about 4 minutes after. I crawled to him. My leg wasn't working right, but it didn't need to work right for crawling. I got to him, and I held pressure on the wounds, and I talked to him, and he talked to me. Malcolm's breathing had become audible, a ragged, arrhythmic sound that belonged in a hospital room rather than a ballroom. He was gripping the handkerchief with both hands now, the fabric bunched against his sternum, and his eyes hadn't left Cole's face. What did he say? Cole closed his own eyes for a half second. When he opened them, they were wet, but his voice held. He talked about your mother, about Eleanor. He said the handkerchief was the last thing she gave him before he shipped out. Said she pressed it into his hand at the airport and told him it was full of luck and that he had to bring it back to her. He pulled it from his pocket right there in the dirt and put it in my hand and told me to keep it. For luck, he said, like she told him. Cole's jaw tightened around the next words, because the next words were the ones that had lived inside his rib cage like a second skeleton, holding him up and weighing him down in equal measure. Then he said, "Tell my brother not to blame himself. Live kind for both of us." Malcolm made a sound, not a word, not a cry, something more fundamental than either the sound of a structure that had been holding for 10 years finally releasing, and he folded forward in the chair someone had pulled beneath him, his forehead nearly touching his knees, the handkerchief crushed against his face. His shoulders heaved with the force of a grief that had never been given adequate information and was now receiving it all at once, in public, under crystal chandeliers, surrounded by 500 people who had paid $1,000 a plate to celebrate his success and were now witnessing the private core of his loss. Nora knelt beside him. Her arm went around his shoulders, pulling him toward her, and for a moment the geometry of the room reversed. The daughter holding the father, the scarred woman steadying the powerful man. The people who had looked away from her pain, now unable to look away from his. Cole stood in the center of it and felt something loosen in his own chest, a knot that had been tightening for a decade thread by thread, pulling against itself until the tension was all he knew. He hadn't told anyone this story, not the counselors at the VA, not the handful of friends he'd made and lost in the transient years between San Antonio and Chicago, not Mrs. Kowalski downstairs who fed him pierogi and never asked questions. He had carried it in silence, the way he carried the handkerchief, close and constant and never displayed, and now it was in the air of a room he had entered as furniture and was standing in as something else entirely. The silence broke, not from the crowd, but from the far side of the bar, where a voice cut through the stillness with the precision of a knife thrown at a conversation that wasn't its business. Hold on. Are we really going to believe a random waiter? He could have found that handkerchief at a thrift store. How convenient that he shows up with a dead soldier's keepsake right when the CEO is emotional. Wade Harmon stepped forward from his group like a man walking onto a stage he believed he owned. The champagne in his hand was nearly empty, his fourth or fifth glass of the evening, and his face wore the expression of someone who had watched the room's attention migrate to a person he considered beneath him and had decided the situation required correction. His friends hung back, their expressions caught between loyalty and the dawning suspicion that their leader was about to step on a landmine. The ballroom split. Cole could feel it happen the way you feel. A change in barometric pressure, a physical shift in the air, as 500 people rapidly sorted themselves into camps. Some nodded at Wade's words, the cautious, self-protective nod of wealthy people for whom skepticism was a financial survival skill. A handkerchief, a story, a waiter who happened to be at the right event at the right time. The coincidence was convenient enough to be suspicious, and suspicion was the default setting of anyone who had spent their career being pitched to. Others shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to align themselves with a man whose cruelty they had witnessed 30 minutes earlier, but equally unwilling to extend unconditional trust to a stranger in a service uniform. Cole did not move, did not speak, did not clench his fists or square his jaw or do any of the things his body was screaming at him to do, because he had been trained by experts in the art of not reacting, and those experts had taught him that the man who moves first in an ambush is the man who dies. Wade was setting a trap. The trap required Cole to look angry, to look defensive, to look like a man whose story was being threatened because the story was a lie. Any display of emotion would feed the narrative Wade was constructing, the narrative of the scheming outsider exploiting a rich man's grief. So Cole stood still and let the accusation pass through him the way a bullet passes through fog, without resistance and without effect. Malcolm rose from the chair. The transformation was remarkable in its speed. 30 seconds earlier, he had been a man broken open by grief, folded in half, face buried in embroidered cotton. Now he straightened, and the CEO reassembled itself around the brother, like armor reassembling around a wound, and when he turned to face Wade Harmon, his eyes were dry and his voice was iron. The stitching on this handkerchief is my mother's. French knot technique. No machine replicates this. I learned to recognize her work before I learned to read. He held the handkerchief up, not displaying it, but presenting it the way a prosecutor presents evidence, letting the fabric speak for itself in the chandelier light. The golden flowers caught the glow and held it. Then Malcolm turned to Cole, and his voice became a different instrument, still hard but calibrated now, probing rather than accusing. What unit? 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry Regiment, 4th Brigade Combat Team, 101st Airborne Division. Forward Operating Base Gardez. Our platoon sergeant was First Sergeant Raymond Costa. The details came without hesitation, without the micro pauses that indicate fabrication delivered in the flat cadence of a man reciting information that had been burned into his neural pathways by repetition and significance. Malcolm processed each one cross-referencing against whatever fragments of official reporting he had received a decade earlier and found no discrepancies. Dean had a tattoo, where the question was a key and only someone who had seen Dean Prescott's body, who had been close enough to read his skin, would have the ability to turn it. Inside of his left forearm. Coordinates. GPS location of your family's lake house in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. He said it was the only place he ever felt peace. Malcolm's hand tightened on the handkerchief. His jaw worked once, twice, grinding against the emotion that was trying to resurface. And when he spoke, the two words carried the full authority of a man who had built an empire on the ability to assess truth. That's him. The confirmation rolled through the ballroom like a verdict. At the cocktail tables, Wade Harmon's face underwent a rapid and involuntary reorganization. The confidence draining out of it, the way color drains from a face receiving bad news, and what replaced it was not quite shame, because shame requires a degree of self-awareness that Wade had not yet achieved, but something adjacent, the discomfort of a man who has bet large on a hand that just lost. He opened his mouth perhaps to offer a caveat, perhaps to retreat with whatever dignity a strategic withdrawal might preserve. But the sound that came out was a mutter pitched just high enough to qualify as audible. Convenient story from a guy who clearly wants something. Malcolm heard it. The room heard it. And something in the equation that Malcolm Prescott had been calculating for the past 5 minutes, the equation that balanced business partnerships against personal honor. 15% ownership stakes against the sound of his daughter being called damaged goods. The decades-long relationship with Harrison, Harmon against the truth that Harrison's son was a small man using big money as a platform for cruelty. That equation resolved. He turned to Wade, and the 5 seconds of silence that preceded his words were more devastating than the words themselves, because in those 5 seconds, every person in the ballroom understood that they were watching a man choose, and the choice was costing him something real. Wade, what you said about my daughter tonight was heard by everyone in this room. Your insinuation about this man's service is beneath contempt. Leave, now, and tell your father that he and I will be having a very different conversation Monday morning. The words arrived without volume, without heat, without any of the theatrical escalation that anger usually demands. They were delivered in the tone of a man signing a document final and irreversible, and they carried with them the implicit acknowledgement of consequences. Monday morning meant the Harmon partnership was finished or would be rebuilt on entirely different terms. It meant 15% of Prescott Holdings was about to become contested territory. It meant Malcolm Prescott, in full view of every business associate and investor in his network, had chosen his daughter over his balance sheet. 2 security guards materialized from the edges of the room with the silent efficiency of men who had been waiting for exactly this signal. They flanked Wade's group, not touching, not speaking, just present, which was enough. Wade's friends moved first, the herd instinct of men who recognize an exit and take it, setting down glasses and straightening jackets, and heading for the door with the studied nonchalance of people pretending they had somewhere else to be anyway. Wade held his ground for 3 additional seconds, his jaw working, his eyes darting between Malcolm and Cole, and the security guards running a calculation of his own, and arriving at the conclusion that no outcome available to him was good. Across the room at table 3, Harrison Harmon rose from his chair. His face was the color of old paper. He did not speak. He did not look at Malcolm. He looked at his son with an expression that Cole recognized from a lifetime of reading faces, the expression of a man who has just realized that the bill for years of indulgence has come due and the amount is larger than expected. Harrison crossed the room, took Wade by the elbow, and walked him toward the exit without a word, and the door closed behind them with a sound that belonged more to a courtroom than a ballroom. Malcolm watched them go. His face was unreadable, the CEO mask back in place, but his hand, the one holding the handkerchief, trembled. Then he turned to the room and the mask came off. Tonight in this room full of power and privilege, a man with nothing, no title, no stock portfolio, no last name that opens doors, gave my daughter more than all my wealth ever could. He gave her respect. He chose kindness when the rest of us chose silence. I am asking myself right now, and I am asking every person in this room, when did success make us this blind? The words fell into the silence like a surgeon's blade, precise and unsparing, cutting through the evening's accumulated pretense. With the efficiency of someone who had spent decades choosing his words for boardrooms and was now choosing them for something that mattered more. No one clapped. No one murmured approval. The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of agreement, but the heavy, shifting silence of people confronting their own reflection in a mirror they hadn't asked for. Several guests looked down at their tables. One woman near the dance floor pressed a napkin to her eyes. A man at table 8 quietly set down his champagne glass and left it there as if the taste had changed. Cole stood at the center of it all, feeling the flush climb his neck, the heat of 500 gazes pressing against him from every direction. He had not wanted this, had not sought it, had entered this building 4 hours ago as a function, a pair of hands attached to a tray, and was now standing in a spotlight that felt less like illumination and more like exposure, the dismantling of the careful invisibility he had spent years constructing. But this was not about him. He knew that with the certainty of a man who had learned at great cost the difference between being at the center of something and being the point of something. Then Nora stepped forward, and the room's attention shifted with an almost audible click, like a compass needle finding north. She had been standing beside her father through all of it, her hand on his arm, her face cycling through expressions that Cole had been tracking the way he tracked everything with peripheral precision. Shock at the handkerchief, pain at the mention of Dean, fury brief and incandescent when Wade had spoken. Pride complicated and new when Malcolm had made his choice. And now as she released her father's arm and took a step toward the center of the floor, something else. Resolution. The particular stillness of a person who has been standing at the edge of a cliff for a very long time and has just decided not to jump, but to stop being afraid of the height. She stood taller than she had at any point in the evening. The navy gown no longer looked like camouflage. The hair that had been drawn like a curtain over the left side of her face remained where it was, but she didn't reach for it, didn't adjust it, didn't use it. The scar was visible. She let it be visible. Her voice started with a tremor that made the first words almost inaudible, and she had to stop and begin again, the way a singer restarts a note that came out wrong. 3 years ago, my mom died in the accident that gave me this scar. Her hand rose to her face, not to cover but to touch her fingertips resting against the raised tissue, the way you might rest your hand on a door before opening it. She was driving. She turned to check on me in the back seat. She wanted to make sure I was okay. And that's when the truck hit us. I survived because she looked at me. I survived because my mother's last act on this earth was turning around to see my face. The ballroom had been silent before. This was a different kind of silence. Deeper, the silence of people hearing something they had not expected and recognizing it as a thing they most needed to hear. Every day since I've hated this scar, not because of how it looks, not because of what people say about it, though they say plenty, and some of them said it tonight right here holding champagne they didn't pay for. A tremor ran through the room at that. At the tables nearest the bar, faces reddened. Not just Wade's group who were gone, but others people who had whispered their own quieter versions of the same assessment and were now watching their words return to them with interest. I hated it because she stopped. The sentence broke in her mouth, and for a moment she stood there, with her lips parted and nothing coming out, the silence of a woman confronting the center of her own wound in front of an audience she hadn't planned on having. Her hands clenched at her sides. She blinked, breathed, found the thread again. Because it's the last thing my mother saw, her daughter's face breaking. And I couldn't stand to look at it because looking at it meant seeing what she saw in the moment she died. Nora's voice cracked on the last word, a fracture line running through the sentence, and she paused again. Not for effect, but because the breath she needed was deeper than the one she had. She found it, pulled it in. When she continued, the tremor was still there, but beneath it was something harder, something that had been tested in the last 30 seconds and had held. Tonight, someone crossed this room and asked me to dance. He didn't look at my scar. He didn't look past it. He looked at me. She faltered on the simplicity of it, as if the plainness of the statement made it harder to say than something more elaborate. Her eyes found Cole's across the 10 feet of polished wood that separated them, and whatever she saw there gave her the last thing she needed. And because of that, I stood up. For the first time in 3 years, I stood up. She paused, swallowed. The next sentence came out quietly, almost to herself, as if she were hearing it for the first time as she said it. Scars don't have to be the whole story. They're just proof you survived the chapter. The applause began at a table near the dance floor, a single pair of hands that sounded tentative and uncertain, as if the person producing the sound wasn't sure it was appropriate. It spread. Not in a wave, not in the unanimous eruption of an audience responding to a standing ovation cue, but in clusters, table by table, the way conviction spreads when it's real rather than performed. Some people stood. Many didn't. The ones who didn't were not necessarily unmoved. Some of them were looking at their own hands and wondering why they couldn't bring them together. And the answer for some was shame, and for others it was the simple, paralyzing difficulty of admitting that you had been wrong about someone, while that someone was standing in front of you with her scar in the chandelier light and her voice still hanging in the air. A woman approached Nora when the applause subsided. Mid-50s pearls, a face that had been carefully maintained against the evidence of time. She stopped 3 feet away and spoke in a voice that was trying very hard to be steady. I'm sorry for my insensitivity. I didn't speak up when I should have. I'm sorry. Nora looked at her. She did not embrace her. She did not absolve her. She nodded once with the economy of someone who understood that forgiveness was a process rather than a transaction, and that a nod was enough for now. The woman returned to her table. Others approached singly and in pairs, offering variations of the same sentiment, and Nora received each one with the same measured nod, neither rejecting nor absolving, simply acknowledging. Malcolm watched his daughter with an expression that Cole had seen only once before, on the face of a man watching a flag being raised over a position that had been fought for. Pride layered over exhaustion, layered over relief, layered over the persistent, ineradicable grief of everything that had been lost to reach this moment. Janet Miller appeared at Cole's elbow. Her approach had been silent, professional, timed to coincide with the slight loosening of the crowd's attention as conversations resumed and glasses were refilled and the evening began tentatively to reassemble itself around its original purpose. Her face was a complex document. The event manager was furious. The human being was something else. She held both in the same expression, the way a person holds two objects of different temperatures in the same hand. That was something, Cole. But you understand that you abandoned your post during a Tier 1 event. I have a hotel to run. Cole met her eyes and gave her the only answer that respected both the rule he had broken and the reason he had broken it. I understand, ma'am. I'll finish my shift and accept whatever comes. Janet studied him for a 3 count that felt longer. Her reading glasses catching the light, her clipboard held against her chest like a shield or a verdict. Then she glanced at Malcolm, who was now standing with his arm around Nora, the handkerchief visible in his free hand like a flag of surrender to something larger than business. Finish your shift. We'll talk tomorrow. She turned and walked back toward the service corridor, and Cole watched her go with the specific relief of a man who has been told that the firing squad has been postponed but not canceled. The evening entered its final hour. The orchestra resumed. Conversations rebuilt themselves from the wreckage of the past 30 minutes. Cole retrieved his folded apron, tied it back on, collected his tray, and returned to the work. Pour, clear, refill, disappear. The motions were automatic, embedded in his hands the way engine diagnostics were embedded in his hands, and he performed them with the same precision he had maintained before the world tilted, because the work didn't change just because you did. Guests moved around him differently now. Some nodded as he passed. An older gentleman at table 9 caught his arm briefly and said something Cole didn't fully register. because his own internal systems were running at the kind of diminished capacity that follows an adrenaline dump. He poured wine, he cleared plates, he kept moving. Near the end, when the ballroom had thinned to a third of its capacity and the orchestra was playing exit music, Malcolm intercepted him between tables 6 and 7 with the purposeful stride of a man who was not accustomed to being kept waiting and was now choosing to wait. The handkerchief was folded in his palm, a recovered treasure. Nora stood nearby, her gown slightly wrinkled, her posture carrying a new architecture, still cautious but no longer compressed. Cole, I want to make you an offer, not as a waiter, but as someone who has shown more character tonight than half the executives in my company. A position at Prescott Holdings. Entry level with full training. I'll cover relocation if needed. You deserve better than this. The offer landed with weight. It was the kind of opportunity that appeared in stories Cole had heard from other veterans. The door that opens because you were in the right place at the right time, and someone powerful decides you're worth investing in. It was generous, it was genuine, and it sat wrong in his chest in the same place where Dean's voice lived. Cole looked at Nora, whose eyes were watching him with the particular attention of someone cataloging data for a decision she hadn't yet made. He looked at Malcolm, whose face held the hope of a man trying to repay a debt that no payment could cover. With all due respect, sir, I don't want a job because I happen to carry your brother's handkerchief. That's not a resume. That's a coincidence wrapped in tragedy. The bluntness landed like a cold front. Malcolm's eyebrows rose a fraction, the involuntary response of a man who was rarely spoken to with that degree of directness. Nora's expression shifted from curiosity to something harder to name, something that might have been respect, wearing the disguise of surprise. Malcolm recalibrated. Cole watched it happen in real time, the executive mind reprocessing the data, discarding the rejected approach, generating an alternative. When he spoke again, his voice was different, slower, stripped of the corporate generosity that had characterized the first offer, and replaced with something more personal. Fair enough. Then let me adjust. I'll sponsor your tuition for that vocational course. No strings, no obligations. Consider it settling a family debt. Dean saved your life. You've given us closure. Let me do this. Cole stood with the offer between them like an object on a table, something he could pick up or leave. Every instinct built by years of self-reliance resisted. Accepting her help felt adjacent to accepting pity, and pity was the thing he had spent his adult life outrunning. But refusing help that could change the trajectory of everything, refusing it out of pride while calling it principle, that was its own kind of cowardice. And Dean Prescott, who had run toward fire while others ran from it, had never been a coward. I'll think about it. Not yes, not no. An honest pause from a man who did not make decisions for an audience. Malcolm nodded, and in the nod, Cole read acceptance, respect, and the patience of a man who understood that some people needed time to accept what was being offered because the offering itself was so foreign to their experience that it required translation. The ballroom continued to empty. Cole worked the final tables, collecting glasses, stacking plates, restoring the room to the blank canvas. It had been before 500 people had filled it with noise and money and the complicated business of being human. The golden light dimmed by degrees as the house staff began shutting down the chandeliers, and the room that had felt like a cathedral of excess at 8 o'clock felt by midnight like a theater after the audience had gone vast and echoing and holding the ghost of whatever had happened on its stage. Cole untied his apron for the last time, folded it, placed it in his locker in the basement room with the cracked mirror and the flickering fluorescent tube, changed out of the vest and tie and into his own clothes, a gray t-shirt and jeans and the work boots he wore to the warehouse. Collected his envelope from the shift manager's office, a standard payout, no bonus, no special treatment. Janet Miller running her operation by the book regardless of whatever miracles occurred upstairs. He counted the bills, $240, less than the $300 he had hoped for. He folded the envelope and put it in his back pocket and walked to the service exit at the rear of the hotel. The alley was narrow and cold. Late March in Chicago, the temperature hovering in the low 30s, the kind of cold that doesn't bite so much as press a steady, patient pressure against every exposed surface. Dumpsters lined one wall. A security light mounted above the door cast a cone of yellow illumination that ended 5 feet from where Cole stood, leaving the rest of the alley in a darkness that was both urban and absolute. His breath made small temporary clouds that dissolved before they reached the edge of the light. He stood there for approximately 45 seconds before it came. It didn't announce itself. It never did. One moment he was standing in an alley behind a hotel in Chicago, his feet on concrete, his breath visible, his mind running the calculations of a shift completed and a night survived. The next moment the concrete was sand and the cold was heat and the yellow security light was the orange pulse of a vehicle burning 40 meters away. And the silence was filled with a sound he had never been able to accurately describe to anyone. Not a bang, not a boom, but a displacement. The sound of air being shoved aside by something that wasn't supposed to exist. And then the secondary sound, which was worse, which was Dean's voice saying his name from very close and very far away at the same time. "Stay with me, Brant." His hands shook. Not the fine tremor he managed every day, the one he could hide by making fists, but a full involuntary shaking that traveled from his fingers up his forearms and into his shoulders and down through his chest into his legs. And he sat down, not by choice but by gravity, his back against the brick wall of the alley, his knees drawn up, his hands laced behind his neck, in the position that some part of his brain still associated with protection, even though it protected against nothing that was threatening him now. The flashback lasted somewhere between 3 minutes and forever. They always did. Time lost its grip during these episodes, stretching and compressing like taffy in the hands of something that didn't care about clocks, and what filled the distorted time was not a coherent narrative but fragments. The smell of burning fuel, the weight of the seat frame on his leg, the heat on his arm, Dean's face in the window, Dean's hands on his vest, Dean running back, the second sound. The silence after the second sound, which was the loudest silence Cole had ever experienced. When it passed, he was sitting on cold concrete in a Chicago alley with tears on his face and his pulse hammering a rhythm that no longer matched any external threat. He sat there for another 2 minutes, breathing the way they had taught him at the VA during the one session he had attended before deciding that talking about it made it worse. Slow inhale through the nose, 4 counts, hold 4 counts, exhale through the mouth, 4 counts, repeat until the world reassembled itself into something you could navigate without screaming. He had held it together all evening, through the dance and the handkerchief and the story and the grief and the accusation and the speech and the applause and the offers and the work. He had held it because holding it was what he did, because falling apart was a luxury that required a safety net, and he had never had one because the story of Dean Prescott's death was a story he had carried in sealed containment for a decade. And tonight he had breached the seal, and the contents were doing what contents do when containment fails. He wiped his face with the hem of his t-shirt, stood up, checked his pockets, wallet, phone, envelope. The inside pocket where the handkerchief had lived was flat, empty. The absence was physical, a missing weight that his body kept reaching for and not finding, like a phantom limb made of cotton and thread. Cole Brant walked home, 7 miles from downtown Chicago to his studio apartment on the south side, through streets that transitioned from the polished limestone of the Magnificent Mile to the cracked concrete of neighborhoods where the streetlights worked on alternate blocks and the buildings wore their age without apology. He walked because walking was marching without a mission, and marching was the thing his body defaulted to when his mind needed to stop, and his mind needed to stop very badly, because the alternative was staying in the alley and letting the flashbacks come back for another round. He did not take a taxi. He did not call a rideshare. He did not stop at the lobby to say goodbye to anyone, not Malcolm, not Nora, not Janet Miller, who would decide his professional fate tomorrow. He simply left the way he had left every situation that threatened to become something more than he could handle, cleanly and completely, and without looking back, because looking back was a luxury that required believing there was something worth returning to. His boots hit the pavement in a rhythm he had learned at Fort Benning and never unlearned the even metronomic cadence of a man covering ground for its own sake. The city passed around him in a blur of late-night traffic and closed storefronts, and the occasional figure on a corner who registered his passing the way he registered theirs, with the mutual disinterest of people occupying the same geography, but not the same world. His left leg ached with each step, the old injury flaring in the cold, the rebuilt bones reminding him that they had been broken and would remember being broken for the rest of his life. 7 miles, approximately 2 hours at his pace, allowing for the limp that emerged after the first 3 miles, and the stop he made at a gas station on Halsted Street to buy a bottle of water because his throat was raw from the cold and from the talking and from the crying he would never admit to. He drank the water standing in the fluorescent glare of the Mouse station lot, surrounded by the smell of gasoline and the distant thud of bass from a passing car. And he thought about nothing, which was the only thing he could afford to think about. When he reached his building, a 3-story walk-up with a buzzer system that hadn't worked since before he moved in, he climbed the stairs to the second floor, unlocked his door, entered his studio apartment, and closed the door behind him with the same care he had used to fold his apron. He sat on the edge of the bed and reached for his inside pocket. His hand found nothing. The gesture, so automatic that it preceded conscious thought, completed itself against flat fabric and empty space, and the absence hit him with a force disproportionate to the size of the missing object. 10 years. Every morning, every evening, the same touch, the same confirmation, the same silent promise to a dead man that the thing he had entrusted would be kept safe. The ritual was over. The object was home. And Cole was here in a studio apartment on the south side of the Chicago, with an empty pocket and a throbbing leg, and the lingering taste of gas station water in his mouth. Halfway across the city, in the lobby of the Grand Lakeview Hotel, the last of the galas flowers were being cleared from the tables, and the last of the staff were signing out, and the marble floors were being polished back to their default state of expensive emptiness. Nora Prescott stood near the coat check counter, her father's car waiting at the curb, her gown slightly crushed from the evening's events. Her hair pushed back from her face on both sides for the first time all night, the scar fully visible under the lobby's white lights, and she was looking for someone who was no longer there. She asked the night manager. She asked the coat check attendant. She asked a busboy carrying a stack of trays toward the service elevator. Each one gave her the same answer in different words, which was that the server named Cole Brandt had clocked out 45 minutes ago and left through the rear exit without speaking to anyone. Nora stood in the empty lobby with her hand resting on the counter and her reflection caught in the polished marble floor, and the reflection showed a woman whose expression was not quite sadness and not quite anger, but something between the two. The specific frustration of someone who had just begun to believe in something and discovered that it had walked out the back door while she wasn't looking. The waiter. Cole, where is he? Nobody knew. The lobby hummed its empty hum. Outside, the car waited. Upstairs, the ballroom was returning to silence. And somewhere on a dark street between downtown and the south side, a man was walking home with an empty pocket and a story that had finally been told, in a future that he could not yet see because the past was still too close, and the distance between them was measured not in miles but in the willingness to stop walking away from the things that might make the walking unnecessary. The light came through the window at an angle that meant he had slept past 7, which almost never happened. Cole opened his eyes to the ceiling of his studio apartment, where a water stain in the shape of nothing in particular had been his first sight every morning for 3 years, and for a disoriented moment he could not locate himself in time. The fan was running, the radiator was ticking. He hadn't eaten anything last night. He had walked 7 miles in the cold, and sat on the edge of his bed and reached for something that wasn't there, and then lay down without undressing and fallen into the kind of sleep that isn't rest but surrender. His left leg announced its opinion of last night's march before he swung it off the bed. The rebuilt bones had a vocabulary of pain that changed with the weather and the workload, and today they were speaking in the sharp percussive dialect of a joint that had been pushed past its tolerance and intended to bill him for the excess. He stood anyway. Standing was not optional. Standing was the first decision of the day, and every decision after it was easier by comparison. He made instant coffee in the chipped mug that Mrs. Kowalski had given him when he moved in, a white mug with a faded image of Wrigley Field that she said had belonged to her late husband, and carried it to the window. The view was the parking lot behind the building, cracked concrete, 3 cars that hadn't moved in weeks, a dumpster with a broken lid. Beyond that, the low roof line of the south side stretching toward a horizon that was neither beautiful nor ugly, but simply present, the landscape of a life that asked nothing of you except that you keep showing up. He sat in the folding chair by the window and drank the coffee and felt the specific emptiness that comes after a long carried weight has been removed. His right hand went to his inside pocket, found flatness, found nothing where something had lived for a decade. The gesture completed itself against air, and his hand came back to his lap, holding absence. That handkerchief had been his compass. He touched it every morning to confirm he was still pointed in the right direction toward the unnamed moment when he would find Dean's people and return it and say the things that needed saying. Now the compass was returned and the moment had happened, and he was sitting at an intersection with no signs and no map, just the persistent instinct that forward was a direction and that not moving was the one thing he couldn't afford. Across the city, in a house Cole had never seen, a different morning was beginning. The Prescott residence in Winnetka occupied a half-acre lot on a tree-lined street where the lawns were maintained by services and the silence was maintained by money. It was the kind of house that communicated its value through restraint rather than spectacle. Brick and limestone 3 stories, mature oaks in the front yard, a circular drive that could accommodate 4 cars without any of them touching. Catherine had chosen it 15 years ago. Malcolm had paid for it. Nora had grown up in it. And for the past 3 years since the accident that had emptied it of one person and hollowed out the other 2, the house had taken on the particular quality of a space that was occupied but not inhabited, rooms full of furniture, that no one sat in, a kitchen with appliances that no one used, hallways where the photographs on the walls tracked the progression of a family that no longer existed in the form the photographs depicted. Nora stood in her bathroom on the 2nd floor facing the mirror above the sink and did something she had not done voluntarily in 3 years. She looked, not a glance, not the peripheral flinching assessment she performed when the mirror caught her off guard. A deliberate, sustained act of looking at her own face, starting from the unmarked right side and then slowly letting her eyes travel left across the scar she had memorized by touch but never studied by sight. The raised tissue caught the bathroom light differently than the skin around it, and she let it. She did not turn away. The voice she heard was not her mother's and not her father's, but belonged to a man she had known for approximately 3 hours. Eyes up, Nora left the bathroom with her hair pushed back on both sides. She dressed in jeans and a gray sweater, clothes that did not coordinate with hiding. She picked up her phone from the nightstand and called the Grand Lakeview Hotel. The front desk connected her to the events office. A woman answered, not Janet Miller, but a morning shift coordinator, who confirmed that Cole Brandt was listed as a part-time event server with no shifts currently scheduled. Nora asked for a phone number or address. The coordinator explained with the practiced sympathy of someone who delivered bad news in small portions for a living that employee contact information was confidential per hotel policy. Nora thanked her and hung up. She sat on the edge of her bed, phone in hand, and considered her options. Malcolm could find Cole in 30 minutes. A phone call to his head of security, a name and a physical description, and the resources of a man who owned commercial real estate in 4 states would locate a part-time server on the south side before lunch. Nora knew this. She also knew that if she asked her father to find Cole, the finding would belong to Malcolm, and whatever happened next would be filtered through the lens of a billionaire's intervention rather than a woman's choice. She did not call Malcolm. She picked up her car keys from the dresser and walked downstairs and out the front door, past the oaks and the maintained lawn, into a March morning that was cold and bright and smelled like the last days of winter conceding ground to something warmer. She got into her car, a silver Audi that had sat largely unused in the garage for 3 years, its odometer a monument to agoraphobia, and she drove south. The drive from Winnetka to the Grand Lakeview took 40 minutes in mid-morning traffic. Nora parked in the guest lot and entered through the main lobby, which in daylight looked like a different building. The chandeliers were off. The marble floors gleamed under fluorescent overheads instead of crystal-filtered gold. A vacuum cleaner droned somewhere in the corridor. She spoke to the concierge, then to a bellhop, then to a line cook who was smoking a cigarette by the loading dock and who, after some consideration, mentioned that the server she was asking about sometimes ate lunch at a taco truck parked near the Amazon warehouse in Joliet. Nora drove to Joliet, 45 minutes southwest on I-55, past the suburban sprawl and into the industrial belt, where the landscape changed from manicured to utilitarian strip malls, giving way to warehouses and distribution centers and the massive featureless fulfillment buildings that process the consumption of a metropolitan area. She had never been to Joliet. She had barely been outside Winnetka in 3 years, and the contrast between the world she was leaving and the world she was entering registered with the force of a translation, the same country expressed in a different vocabulary. She found the warehouse complex. She found the taco truck, a converted panel van, parked at the edge of a gravel lot between two loading docks, its window propped open, its menu hand-painted on a plywood board. She parked the Audi between a pickup truck with a cracked tailgate and a sedan held together by rust and optimism, and she sat for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel, feeling the improbability of her own presence in this place. Then she saw him, sitting on a wooden pallet behind the warehouse, his back against the corrugated metal wall, eating a burrito. Work boots, cargo pants, a gray t-shirt, dark with sweat at the collar. His hair was damp and pushed back from his forehead, and the muscles of his forearms, visible below the rolled sleeves, carried the particular definition of someone who had spent the morning lifting heavy objects for money. He looked nothing like the man in the black vest. He looked like what he was, a laborer on a lunch break occupying the 15 minutes of stillness that the clock allowed before the next shift of loading and unloading and carrying and stacking resumed. Nora got out of the car. The gravel crunched under her shoes, sneakers she hadn't worn since college, and Cole looked up at the sound, and the expression that crossed his face was not what she had hoped for. It was not hostility. It was not indifference. It was the expression of a man who had closed a book and set it on a shelf and found someone standing in his living room holding it open to the page where he'd stopped. "How did you find me?" Her voice was steadier than she expected, drawing strength from the 45 minutes of highway driving and the unfamiliar act of wanting something enough to pursue it. "I asked around. You're not as invisible as you think." The words landed between them, factual and faintly challenging, and Cole absorbed them with a stillness that could be mistaken for calm, but was actually the disciplined suppression of a response that hadn't been fully vetted. He looked at her, and the jeans and the sneakers, and the hair pushed back from both sides of her face, the scar unconcealed in the March sunlight, and something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation of an equation he had believed was solved. He moved over on the pallet, an inch, the minimum spatial concession of a man who was not ready to share his lunch break, but was unwilling to be rude to a woman who had driven 45 miles to sit on industrial lumber. Nara sat. The wood was rough through her jeans. The air smelled of diesel exhaust and whatever was cooking in the taco truck, and the flat metallic scent of a warehouse district in late winter. Cole finished chewing, set the burrito down on its foil wrapper, looked at the parking lot. "I don't belong in your world and you don't belong in mine. Pretending otherwise helps no one." The words were not cruel. They were surgical. The precise, clean incision of a man excising something before it could grow into a complication, delivered with the same economy of motion he applied to everything. No wasted energy, no ambiguity, just the blade and the cut and the expectation that the patient would understand the necessity. Nora did not flinch. The scar on her face had absorbed worse than honesty, and the 3 years she had spent hiding from the world had given her, if nothing else, a high tolerance for being told that she didn't belong. "You don't get to decide that for me." Cole's jaw tightened. The response was not what his script called for. His script called for her to accept the dismissal with grace, to return to her Audi and her Winnetka house, to process the previous evening as a singular event, beautiful and finite. That was the clean ending. That was the ending that required nothing further from him. "I'm not deciding for you. I'm deciding for me." The silence that followed lasted long enough for a forklift to cross the loading dock behind them, its reverse alarm beeping in the flat, insistent pattern that sounds the same in every warehouse in America. Nora let the silence work. She had not come 45 miles to argue about who belonged where. She had come for something specific, and the argument, such as it was just the lock she had to pick before she could reach it. "What else did Uncle Dean say?" Cole's hand, which had been resting on his knee, went still. Not tense. Still. The stillness of a man who has heard a question he knew was coming and has not yet decided how much of the answer to release. "Dad told me you only shared part of it last night. I could see on your face. You were holding something back." She was right. Cole had held back the part of Dean's words that were not about Malcolm, the part that was about a girl. Dean had never met a niece whose photograph he had carried in his cargo pocket, alongside the handkerchief and the coordinates of a lake house in Wisconsin. He had held it back because telling Nora what Dean had said about her was something more intimate, a message addressed to a specific person that had been waiting 10 years for delivery, and that Cole had not felt right delivering in a ballroom full of strangers. He had the right now. They were alone on a pallet behind a warehouse with no audience and no chandelier light, just two people in a dead man's words. Dean knew Malcolm had a daughter. He'd seen photos. He carried one in his pocket, actually. Little girl with pigtails sitting on a dock somewhere. Lake Geneva probably given the tattoo. And when he was lying there after he said, Cole paused. Not for drama. Because the words were stored in a part of his memory that was adjacent to the pain, and accessing them required passing through territory that his body still interpreted as danger. He said, tell my brother to make sure that little girl knows she doesn't need to be perfect. Tell her that being alive is enough. Tell her that her uncle would have spoiled her rotten. Nora's composure held for approximately 4 seconds after the last word. Then it broke, not spectacularly, not with the dramatic shattering that grief performs in front of audiences, but quietly the way ice breaks on a pond in early spring, cracking along lines that were already there. Tears ran down both sides of her face, and she did not wipe them away. She sat on the pallet with her hands in her lap and let them fall. I was 14 when he died. I never met him. I didn't even go to the funeral because Dad thought I was too young, and he was already thinking about me. Cole looked at her, and he recognized the specific quality of her grief, which was not the fresh, hot grief of new loss, but the cold, structural grief of discovering that someone you never knew had loved you, that across an ocean in a decade, and the impossible distance between the living and the dead. A man had spent his last conscious minutes thinking about a girl with pigtails on a dock. That's the kind of person he was. He saved lives thinking about the people those lives would go home to. The words hung in the diesel-scented air of the parking lot, and Nora heard them with the part of her that was still the psychology student who had earned a 3.8 at Northwestern before a truck on Lakeshore Drive had rewritten her future. Dean had died so that others could live. She had survived and then spent 3 years choosing not to. The math of that was simple enough to be devastating, and she felt it land in her chest with the weight of something she could no longer refuse to carry. Cole rolled up his left sleeve. The gesture was deliberate, unhurried, performed with the specific intention of showing rather than telling. And when the fabric cleared his forearm, the burn scar was visible in full daylight for the first time in Nora's presence. She looked at it without flinching, the way he had looked at hers, and in the mutual act of looking, without turning away, something settled between them that had not been there before. He told her more. Not everything. Not the full clinical inventory of his damage, because the full inventory was a document that no single conversation could contain. But enough. The nights when sleep wouldn't come, and the fan wasn't loud enough, and the distance between the south side and a burning truck collapsed to nothing. The mornings when a car backfiring on the street below sent him to the floor before his conscious mind could intervene. The way crowds felt like ambush positions, and silence felt like the prelude to detonation, and the only time his hands were truly steady was when they were inside an engine working with wrenches and sockets on problems that had solutions. He told her these things not because he wanted sympathy, and not because the moment demanded confession, but because she had shown him her scar in front of 500 people. And fairness, the particular military fairness of shared risk and mutual exposure, required that he show her his. An exchange of evidence. A treaty between two people who had been damaged by events they did not choose and were trying each in their own way to stop letting the damage be the only thing that defined them. Nora listened without interrupting. Her tears had dried on her face, leaving faint tracks that the wind was already erasing, and her expression held the focused, analytical quality of someone processing information with professional attention. We're both stuck in the day that changed everything, aren't we? Her voice was calm, observational, carrying the tone of a diagnosis rather than a complaint. Cole considered the assessment with the seriousness it deserved because it was accurate, and accuracy was something he respected above almost everything else. Yeah, but being stuck doesn't mean we have to stay stuck. The sentence arrived without planning, symbolized by some part of his mind that was apparently capable of clarity, even when the rest of him was sitting on a pallet eating a cold burrito next to a woman he had known for less than 24 hours. He heard it after he said it, the way you sometimes hear a note after a guitar string has been struck, and he recognized it as something he had needed to say to himself for a very long time, and had needed someone else present to say it to. Cole's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at the screen. Unknown number. Chicago area code. Malcolm's voice came through with the particular clarity of a man making a phone call he had rehearsed. Mr. Brandt, my daughter apparently found you before I could. I want to reiterate my offer with modifications. The Lincoln Tech tuition full sponsorship, no conditions, no contracts, no strings. I also spoke this morning with a friend of mine. Retired Army, runs a veteran-owned auto shop in Pilsen. Name's Tom Gentry. He's looking for an apprentice. If you're interested, it's yours to explore. Not a gift. An introduction. What you do with it is on you. Cole held the phone and listened to the offer reshape itself in real time. This was not the corporate position Malcolm had offered in the ballroom. This was different. A veteran-owned shop in Pilsen was a language Cole spoke. It was engine grease and torque wrenches and the specific camaraderie of men who had served and who understood, without needing to discuss it, the distance between the person you were before and the person you became after. Malcolm had listened, not just heard but listened, which in Cole's experience were two activities so different they might as well be different senses. The tuition I'll accept. The shop I want to earn my way in. Can I apply like anyone else? The negotiation took 10 seconds. Malcolm agreed. He would send Gentry's name and address. The rest was Cole's to navigate. The call ended with the brevity of two men who respected each other enough to skip the pleasantries. Nora had listened to Cole's half of the conversation without comment, her face showing the particular expression of someone watching a puzzle piece find its slot. The silence between them shifted, not uncomfortable, rearranging. The space that had been occupied by the pass-by Dean and the handkerchief in the ballroom and the scar opened slightly to admit something else. Something that faced forward instead of backward. Nora spoke with the measured clarity of someone announcing a decision that had been forming for longer than the conversation, but had only just found its final shape. I'm going back to Northwestern. I dropped out after the accident. I was studying psychology. Thought I wanted to be a therapist. I think I want to work with veterans. People like you. People carrying things they don't talk about. Cole looked at her. The sun had shifted while they talked, moving behind the warehouse and casting the pallet in shade, and in the cooler light her face held a steadiness that had not been there in the ballroom. Not confidence, not yet, but the precursor to confidence, the way a foundation is the precursor to a building. That's not a small thing. No, but neither was asking me to dance. The words connected 2 moments across 12 hours and 45 miles. The ballroom and the parking lot, the chandelier light and the diesel fumes, and in the connection, Cole felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was the sensation of being part of a story that was still being written, rather than one that had already ended. Dean had saved his life. He had carried Dean's words across a decade. Those words had reached Nora in a ballroom and followed her to a parking lot in Joliet, and were now pointing her toward a future that would bring her back to people like Cole, veterans carrying invisible weight, and she would know how to find them because she had found him on a pallet behind a warehouse with nothing but a name and a taco truck. Eleanor had stitched forget-me-nots on cotton for a son going to war. The son had given the cotton to a stranger in a ditch. The stranger had carried it for 10 years and dropped it on a dance floor. The dance floor had led to a speech. The speech had led to a search. The search had led to a pallet. And the pallet had led to a decision that would send a young woman back to a university to learn how to help the people her uncle had died serving. A week passed. Cole worked his shifts. Warehouse in the morning. DoorDash in the afternoon. And on the last evening, one final shift at the Grand Lakeview Hotel, his last before the Lincoln Tech program began. Janet Miller found him in the service corridor before his shift. What you did last week broke about 12 hotel policies. I should have written you up. A pause that contained its own weather system, cold front meeting, warm front, the turbulence of a decision being finalized. I didn't. Don't make me regret it. Yes, ma'am. The shift was a small corporate event, 80 guests, a pharmaceutical company celebrating a product launch. No VIPs, no gala, no 500 people, and no crystal chandeliers at full brightness. Cole worked it the way he had worked every event before, the one that changed everything with precision and silence, and the invisible efficiency that was his trade. He poured wine, cleared plates, refilled water glasses, collected his final envelope from the shift manager's office. He changed in the locker room. The cracked mirror, the flickering light. He looked at his reflection in the split glass, and neither of the two misaligned versions was the same face that had stood here a week ago. Something had shifted. Not dramatically. A structural adjustment, a load-bearing wall relocated by an inch, changing the distribution of weight throughout the entire building without altering the facade. He walked out through the service corridor and into the hotel lobby, which at 11:15 on a weeknight was nearly empty, the marble floors reflecting the overhead lights in long, undisturbed streaks. The quiet was the ordinary quiet of a building at rest, and Cole moved through it with the intention of crossing to the rear exit and beginning the walk home, his last walk from this job to his apartment. Nora was standing near the coat check counter. She wore a denim jacket over a dark sweater, her hair pulled back in a loose knot, sneakers on her feet. The scar was present the way a feature of a landscape is present, part of the terrain, rather than a commentary on it. She held two paper cups of coffee, one in each hand, steam rising from the lids into the climate-controlled air. "I owed you a coffee. You disappeared before I could buy you one." Cole looked at her standing there in the empty lobby with her two cups of coffee and her sneakers, and the expression on her face that was not gratitude and not obligation, but something simpler and rarer, the expression of a person who wanted to be exactly where they were. And something happened to his face that surprised him more than anything that had happened in the previous week. He smiled. It was not a large smile. It was small and brief and slightly lopsided, the product of facial muscles that had been out of practice for so long that the movement felt foreign, like speaking a language you learned as a child and haven't used in years. But it was real. It was involuntary. It was the first genuine smile he had produced since before a road near Gardez had rearranged his understanding of what the world was capable of doing to people. He couldn't remember the last time he had smiled simply because he wanted to. The mechanism had rusted. Tonight it remembered. He took the coffee she offered, lifted the lid, sipped. The liquid was lukewarm and bitter and tasted like it had been brewed approximately 6 hours ago by a machine that had never been cleaned. "This is actually terrible coffee." Nora's face broke into a grin. Sudden and unguarded, the scar pulling at her cheek in a way that was no longer a distortion, but an accent, a notation in the margin of an expression that was more interesting for its asymmetry than it would have been without it. "I know. I've never bought coffee for anyone before. I panicked and got it from a gas station. Gas station coffee at midnight. I've had worse MREs." The laughter that followed was small and shared and specific to the two of them, the kind of laughter that is not about the joke, but about the act of laughing itself, the mutual recognition that something heavy had been set down and something lighter had been picked up. They stood in the lobby, drinking bad coffee, and the conversation that followed was about transmissions. She asked what he liked most about working on cars, and he told her the truth, which was that transmissions were his favorite because they were puzzles. Hundreds of interlocking parts that had to work in precise coordination, and when one failed, the challenge was not just to find the broken piece, but to understand how that piece's failure affected every other piece in the system. She asked if he was nervous about Lincoln Tech. He told her that nervous wasn't the right word. Ready was closer, ready the way you're ready for a mission you've been briefing for months. She told him she had submitted her readmission application to Northwestern on Wednesday. The psychology department had responded within 48 hours, which she attributed either to the Prescott name or to the unusual nature of her personal statement, which she had written in one sitting on Thursday morning, and which contained, she admitted, more honesty than any document she had produced in her life. The lobby's sound system, set to a low nighttime playlist, produced a piano jazz melody that drifted through the open space like smoke, unhurried and purposeless, and exactly right. Nora set her coffee cup on the counter. "One more for the road." Cole set his cup beside hers, stood, offered his hand, not the formal gesture of a week ago, not the parade rest posture and the careful distance and the awareness of 500 witnesses. Just a hand extended across 18 inches of air, palm up, an invitation that carried no weight beyond itself. She took it, warm this time, steady, no tremor. They danced in the lobby of the Grand Lakeview Hotel between the coat check counter and a leather sofa and a potted ficus that had seen better days on marble floors that were not a dance floor under fluorescent lights, that were not chandeliers, accompanied by a piano recording that was not a live orchestra. There was no audience, no ballroom, no gala, no 500 people watching and judging and whispering. There was only the music and the movement and the two of them stepping slowly through a rhythm that neither of them would have called dancing, but that accomplished everything dancing is supposed to accomplish, which is to allow two people to be close without needing a reason. Nora leaned her head against his shoulder, just for a moment, a breath's duration, and beneath the layers of fabric separating them, his scarred arm and her scarred face occupied the same quiet space, two pieces of evidence that did not need to be explained because the person they were presented to already understood the language they were written in. The song ended. They didn't notice the transition to the next one. When they finally stopped, it was because the night clerk had started closing the lobby, dimming lights, and locking the front doors with the apologetic efficiency of someone who respected the moment, but also respected her shift schedule. Nora stepped back. Her face held an expression Cole had not seen on it before. Not happiness in the effervescent, uncomplicated sense, but something deeper and more durable. The expression of a person who has located solid ground after a long time in open water. "I won't forget you, Cole Brandt." The words were simple and direct and carried no subtext beyond their literal meaning, which was a promise not of love or commitment or any of the contractual obligations that such words sometimes smuggle into a conversation, but of memory, the assurance that whatever happened next, this night and the night before, it would remain fixed and indelible in the place where the things that changed you are stored. "You don't have to forget. Just keep moving forward." She nodded, held his gaze for 3 seconds that contained no drama and no suspense. Just the quiet mutual acknowledgement of two people who had found each other at the exact moment when finding was possible, and who understood that the finding was not an ending but a beginning, and that beginnings by definition required moving towards something rather than standing still. She left through the front door. He watched her cross the lobby, her denim jacket and her sneakers passing through the last of the light, and then the door closed and she was gone, and the lobby was empty, and Cole Brandt stood alone on the marble floor with 2 paper cups of terrible coffee cooling on the counter beside him. He walked to the rear exit, the service corridor, the alley, the same cold, the same dumpsters, the same yellow security light throwing its cone against the brick wall. A week ago, he had sat against this wall with his knees drawn up and his hands shaking. Tonight, the wall was just a wall. The alley was just an alley. The cold was just cold. His hand went to his inside pocket. The gesture was automatic, the ghost of a ritual that no longer had an object, and his fingers pressed against flat fabric and found nothing. And for the first time, the nothing felt like something. Not absence. Space, the space left behind when you set down a weight you've been carrying so long that your body shaped itself around it. And the setting down changes your shape, and the new shape is lighter but unfamiliar, and you have to learn how to stand inside it. The handkerchief was home. It was in a house in Winnetka, in the hands of a man who had lost a brother and found a piece of him again, and it would stay there, stitched with forget-me-nots and the initials of a dead sergeant who had run toward fire and left behind a message that had taken a decade to deliver. The debt was paid, the compass was returned. And Cole was standing in an alley in Chicago with an empty pocket and a full future, and the number of a woman saved in his phone and the address of a veteran-owned auto shop in Pilsen folded in his wallet, and the start date of a program at Lincoln Tech circled on a calendar in his apartment, and the taste of terrible gas station coffee still on his tongue. He took out his phone, opened contacts. Nora Prescott. She had entered her number while they drank coffee, taking his phone from his hand with the matter-of-fact boldness of someone who had decided that waiting to be asked was a luxury she was done affording herself. The number sat on the screen, 10 digits of bridge, between the South Side and Winnetka, between a studio apartment and a limestone house, between a man who fixed things with his hands and a woman who intended to fix things with her mind. He looked at the number, smiled the small, lopsided smile that was becoming less foreign by the hour. Put the phone back in his pocket. Not yet, not tonight. Tonight was for walking, not calling. But the number was there, the road was there, the direction was forward. Cole stepped out of the alley and onto the sidewalk. Michigan Avenue stretched south ahead of him, streetlights casting pools of amber on the pavement, the March wind carrying the faint distant sound of the lake. And above the buildings, the sky held the particular quality of a Chicago night in early spring. Not dark and not light, but something between the city's glow, reflected off a low ceiling of cloud that looked like it might clear by morning. His boots found the sidewalk. left, right, the rhythm as old as his first day at Fort Benning and as new as the decision to keep it going. His left leg ached. It would always ache. The scar on his arm pulled when the wind hit it. It would always pull. These were the terms of his contract with survival. The fine print written in tissue and bone, and he had signed it 10 years ago on a road near Gardez when a man named Dean Prescott had reached into a burning vehicle and pulled him out and told him to live. His hands were steady. The street lights led south one after another, a chain of amber lanterns strung along the avenue like a path laid out by someone who believed he would follow it. He did not hurry. There was no shift to make, no alarm to set, no tray to carry. There was only the walk and the night and the slowly warming air and the knowledge that tomorrow held a shape he had chosen rather than one that had been imposed. Dean told him to live kind. He was trying. Some nights that was enough. But tonight, walking south on a street lit by amber and faintly warmed by the memory of terrible coffee and a borrowed song, and a woman who had driven 45 miles to sit on a wooden pallet tonight, he thought he wanted more than enough. He thought he wanted the whole thing. The garage, the work, the life built with hands that had learned to stop shaking, the possibility of a person standing next to him who understood the weight because she carried her own. The walk home was 7 miles. He had made it before. He would make it again. But this time the direction wasn't away from something. The direction was toward